Today's video is on active learning. Active learning was developed by Dr. Lily Nielsen for learners of all ages with significant disabilities who have a developmental age of 4 or under. The approach is closely tied to evidence-based research, such as the work as Piaget's developmental stages of learners. It views the child's developmental holistically, including not only motor, cognitive, and sensory skills, but also social and emotional development. This total approach is for instructing individuals with severe multiple disabilities. Dr. Nielsen had over 50 years of experience with vision and multiple disabilities. She authored 9 books, 20 articles in professional journals, and a countless number of trainings throughout the world. She was considered the top expert in education of children with multiple disabilities. The active learning approach, or ALA, emphasizes that all individuals learn best by active participation. All activity, especially in the earliest stages of development, actually wires our brain and establishes the critical foundation that we need of the concepts and skills necessary for future learning. Play can be based on sensory, neuromuscle, cognitive, or any combination of the three. It involves repetition of experience, exploration, experimentation, and limitation of one's surroundings. It functions as an agent for integrating the internal and external worlds. It follows a sequential developmental progression, and children move rapidly from one activity to the next before coming back to the original activity. They are developing attention, but are also heavily engaged in making sense of the world by comparing activities and experiences. The opportunity to repeat an experience or practice a skill is sometimes lacking for the learner with visual and multiple disabilities. Our goal should be to find ways to help the individual with special needs spend their days more like their typically developing peers. Dr. Nielsen's approach this issue through the development of perceptualizing aids and specific strategies for instruction, such as the 5 key points of active learning and the 5 phases of educational treatment. Today we will discuss the 5 key points of active learning. Individuals with multiple disabilities are at a great risk of developing reliance on others to interact with the world around them. They learn to be a passive learner rather than an active participant in their learning, waiting for adults to provide the activity rather than seeking it out on their own. Children and adults with special needs often develop stereotypical or aggressive behaviors to cope with their lack of active learning opportunities. We have to set up opportunities for them to trust and be successful in order for them to feel comfortable experiencing and exploring the world around them. Most experiences require the use of all senses, motor, and cognitive skills. Being able to combine all of these may be more challenging for a child with significant developmental disabilities. The chart above of the cone of learning explains what we see, hear, and do affect our learning. As you can see, 90% of what we say and hear and do result in active learning. The first step in determining what a child needs to be an active learner is to observe and assess the developmental level. This can be completed by an individual functional scheme assessment developed by Dr. Lily Nielsen. In this assessment, you would assess the gross motor, fine motor, mouth movement, haptic tactile perception, language, nonverbal, verbal, and comprehension, social perception, play and activities, undressing and dressing skills, eating skills, and many others. You would need to look at the child's strengths and their abilities and preferences, and the weaknesses, which may include other disabilities that are listed, and how do they explore their world? What sense do they use the most to gain the most information? In order for a child to learn at their fullest potential, we must create learning environments that facilitate the child's learning at any time, facilitate learning at any developmental level. We must encourage the learner to explore and experiment actively. We must enable the learner to repeat his or her activities as many times as needed. We must enable the learner to be active without interference from others. That includes talking, sounds, or other distractions throughout the room. We must allow the learner to use previously achieved skills and enhance the learner's self-esteem through active participation. The active learning approach is based on the thought process that everyone can learn. We must provide activities that are developmentally appropriate and reinforcing to the individual. Children learn by exploration and the repetition of opportunities and are not neurologically prepared to learn through direct teaching until 4 to 5 years old. As the adults, we must use a hands-off approach and have control of their own hands. When using hand over hand, you take away the kinesthetic and tactile concept development. Observe them, watch them, but don't interrupt and limit the distractions. ALA identifies 4 stages of learning. Stage 1 is awareness and interest. Stage 2, curious and active. Stage 3, learning or habituation. Stage 4 is ready for new challenges. And then you proceed back to stage 1 to add new skills to the activity or learn a new skill. When a child or adult becomes stuck in a specific stage, then disharmonic learning occurs. It can occur at any stage and for various reasons. Self-injurious, self-stimulatory, and aggressive behaviors can be a sign of disharmonic learning, and identifying and correcting that cause is imperative in fostering skill attainment. Remember that a break can occur at any stage of the dynamic learning circle, causing the individual to get stuck. However, understand that stereotypical behaviors are part of the child's personality and should be respected. Otherwise, you are requesting the child to change their personality. The above stages represent how someone learns a new skill. By understanding this process, you can find out what is disrupting learning in the environment and change the environment. Identifying and correcting the cause is imperative to the student learning and attaining the skills that are needed.
In the first stage of the dynamic learning circle, a child or a learner becomes aware and interested in something. Typically, they're going to become aware of one of 3 things. The first thing they could be aware of is their own sensory or motor activities. It could be they're moving an arm, moving a leg, moving their head. The second thing that they could become aware of is an object in the environment. And the last thing that they could become aware of would be a person or people in the environment. I'd like to give you an example of how a child goes through the dynamic learning circle in stage 1. So for this example, I'd like you to pretend that I'm a child with multiple special needs. I'm going to be someone who's visually impaired, as well as a child with cerebral palsy. So let's say that I have hands that have high muscle tone or spastic cerebral palsy, and I keep my thumb to the palm of my hand, and I keep my fingers over my thumb. And let's say that my arms tend to naturally kind of fall in a position to the sides of my body. I'd like to introduce this child to this item, which is a whisk. Most people would take the whisk and set it down in front of the child. Let's say I'm in my wheelchair. They might put the whisk down on the table or on the wheelchair tray in front of the child. So I'm sitting in my chair, I can't see, and my hands are fisted like this, and I would have to ask you, is this child aware of the object that's in front of me? And I would say the answer is no. If I'm visually impaired and I have cerebral palsy and someone sets a whisk down in front of me, I'm not aware that it exists at all because I'm not touching the object, I'm not doing anything to the object, I might not even know it's there. So let's say now that the person wants to try to make you aware of the object. So sometimes people might take the object and slam it on the table. So now am I aware of the object? Well, a child with multiple special needs, especially if they're visually impaired, might hear sounds going around them all the time. So do they really understand that there was a sound that they can interact with, or do they just hear that sound as something else in the environment that they should ignore? So in stage 1 of the dynamic learning circle, I have to get that child to be aware of their own activity, their own sensory activities, or objects or people in the environment. A lot of people will then say, okay, I want this child to touch this whisk. I'll take their hands that are up here and I will grab their hand and bring it down to the object. And I have to tell you that's the absolute wrong thing to do when you're trying to practice active learning techniques. You never take the child and bring the child to the object. You have to do the exact opposite. You need to take the object and bring the object to the child. So how do you do that with someone who's in a wheelchair, whose hands are sitting up like this when they can't touch the table? And the answer is a simple one. You have to pick up the object and bring it to the child's hand. Okay? So you're going to have an object that you want a child to be introduced to, and someone's going to have to hold that object close to that child so that it's barely touching their hand like this. Now a child could be aware of the object because their hand is actually touching the object. So let's say instead of me holding it up like this, I'm just going to hold it in front of me so you guys can see it. So now that the object is in front of a child like this, they might become aware of their own motor activity or their own sensory input. Let's say that child doesn't like that toy. Maybe they move their hand away from the object. What's kind of interesting about children is they tend to have a natural position that they go back to. So typically if you just leave the object where you had it, that child will move their hand back to that object and they might touch it again. Maybe they move their hand away from it, but eventually that hand might come back and touch the object again. It's very important in active learning that you don't chase the child around with the objects. So if the child moves their hand over here, you don't move the object over here. You leave it where you started so that that child can decide to come back if they want to figure out where that object was. So in stage 1, let me just repeat that the most important part is that a child becomes aware and interested in their own movement activity, an object in the environment, or people in the environment. That's all of stage 1. If a child's not aware of the object, then they haven't even hit stage 1 of the dynamic learning circle, and you have to change the environment so that they can be aware of their environment. Now that a child is aware of an object or their own movement in the environment, we're going to move on to stage 2. And in stage 2, a child becomes curious and interested, and that's going to lead to something. So now you have a child who's actually aware of the whisk because you've moved the whisk so that that child's hand or arm is touching it. I do want to make a point. It doesn't have to be the hand and it doesn't have to be the arm. It could be a child's mouth, it could be their feet, it could be their legs, any part of the body. But just for this demonstration, I'm going to talk about moving an object toward a child's hand. So you've moved the whisk and it's actually slightly touching a child's hand. You have to learn to wait and see what happens. So let's say this object has been sitting here for 5 minutes and that child barely moves at all. But then all of a sudden they decide to move their hand away and they come back to it. Hopefully that child becomes curious and interested, which leads to activity. So maybe they start to go, you know, there's something there. And they start to just move their hand ever so slightly where it's actually coming in contact with the object. And if you can listen closely, you can actually hear the whisk making a little dinging sound. And so now that child is getting auditory feedback from what they're doing. They're also getting tactile feedback from what they're doing. I can feel that that object, it actually vibrates a little bit when I hit it. It makes a sound when I hit it. And if you watch my hand, I'm kind of playing with how I'm hitting the whisk. I might decide to hit it really hard, or I might decide to hit it really softly. So you have a child who's become curious and they're interested, and that leads to something. So what does it lead to? It leads to making a repetition. So now this child is repeating over and over again hitting this object. While they're repeating their activity, their brain is making a memory about that activity. So my brain is understanding, hey, when I hit this object hard, it makes that kind of sound. If I hit it lightly, it makes that kind of sound. What happens if I take the object and hit it this way and it whacks me in the head? Maybe I don't like that, so maybe I don't want to do that again. And a child is experimenting, exploring, and figuring out, what does this thing do? So let's go back again to a child with cerebral palsy. If their hand is fisted, they may never open up their hand, and they may just push the object and understand what happens when I push my hand on this whisk. So you're repeating an activity, you're establishing memories about that activity, you're experimenting, you're exploring, and maybe comparing. If there happened to be another whisk hanging here, maybe that child's going to push between the two objects and figure out how the two whisks are different. That's all that happens with a child in stage 2, is that they're curious and they're interested, and that leads to activity. Now, a child could also respond to people in the environment, or they could share their experiences with people. I want to try to stick for this example to only be talking about the objects in the environment and the movement of the child and their sensory experiences. We're going to talk later about interactions with other people when we cover the 5 phases of educational treatment, but I want to let that idea go until a later point. So let's just stick with the object in the environment. The one most important thing about stage 2 is that you notice that this child, if it's me, that I'm initiating activity. I didn't need help from anyone other than to position the object so that I could be the one that decides to be active. That's what active learning is. It's the child being the active participant, not having things done to them, but them deciding, I'd like to make that sound, and figuring out how to make that activity happen. Now, most people will sit and say, well, how long is the child going to stay in stage 2 before they go on to stage 3? And I'm going to tell you, I can't answer that question. It's going to vary for every child and every activity that you do. So it could last 5 seconds, it could last 2 hours, it could last 3 months, and it can last 3 years. As long as that child is active and they're learning from their activity, and they're learning and experimenting and exploring, then that's how long that child needs to gain an understanding about the object. And then once they do, we're going to be moving on to stage 3. So after a child's been in stage 2 for quite a while, obviously they're going to move on to stage 3. And stage 3 is that a child finally completes learning with that activity. So this child's been given this whisk and has been pushing it for, let's say, 3 months. During that time, they've been experimenting, they've been exploring, and understanding maybe that this is metal, maybe that it's a little cool to the touch, all those kind of things. Not necessarily with anyone having to tell them that it's a whisk or that it's metal, but just in their own actions, they're understanding what metal is and how a whisk responds. So now they move on to stage 3, which is that they've completed their learning. How do you know that they've completed their learning? Well, the first sign is that that child has repeated their actions to a point that it becomes part of their everyday patterns. So every day you give them this whisk, it takes them about 1 second before they go, oh yeah, I know what to do with that, and they just start hitting the whisk. Okay? And then you're going to notice that their activity becomes to such a level that it's so familiar to them that there's no challenges to it. They're not doing anything different with the whisk. It's the same activity every day. They're just banging on the whisk because there's nothing else that they can do with the whisk. So in stage 3, the actions are so familiar that there's no more challenges to the child. And those are the two most important characteristics of stage 3. That the activity is repeated to such a point that it's part of the child's everyday actions, and that it presents no more challenges to the child. After a child has reached stage 3, obviously they're ready to move on to stage 4, which is that a child is ready for new challenges, which will lead to new awareness and new interests. But it can only do that under 4 conditions. And one of them is that a child has to be given new sensory and motor activities. The second one is that a child has to be given new actions of others to imitate. And the most important thing about stage 4 is that they can only learn about new activities if the activities presented are at the child's developmental level. If you give them something that's way too hard for them, they're just going to shut down and not want to explore that new opportunity. So it's very, very important with active learning that all activities be presented at a child's developmental level. And also, a child wants people to take interest in what they're doing. So it's important for people in the environment to recognize what that child is doing. So how do we turn this whisk from stage 3 that they've completed learning with into a new object or activity for them to play with? So it's simple. We're just going to add one thing. We're going to take a ping pong ball and stick it inside the whisk. So now what happens is you've given this child a new activity that's at their developmental level because all you did was add a change to it ever so slightly, which is a ping pong ball. So now that child goes back to stage 1, which is why we call it a dynamic learning circle. It's going to go from being aware to acting to learning to completing learning and being ready for a new skill. So the new skill is now a whisk with a ping pong ball. They're aware of the object. They go to stage 2 again. They start acting on that object. But this time you have a child go, wait a second, that's not the sound I heard before when I was doing it without the ping pong ball. When you add the ping pong ball and you start banging on it, it makes a different sound. So now that child is experimenting and exploring with the whisk with the ping pong ball and comparing it to the memory that they had before of the whisk without the ping pong ball. And so maybe they bang on it and bang on it and bang on it, but now maybe they open up that finger that has cerebral palsy to figure out what's inside the ping pong ball. And if you're paying attention, they're learning a new skill, which is how to open up the hand. And maybe they take those fingers and they start to play with it where the ping pong ball falls out of the ping pong ball whisk. Now what they need is an adult to take the ping pong ball and put it back in the whisk so that that child can repeat the activity that they just learned. Before they only pushed the ping pong ball in the whisk. Now they're opening up their hand and taking something apart. Okay? But most children only learn to take apart before they learn to put together. So they have to repeat and repeat and repeat over and over again the taking apart skill before they've learned all they can learn from taking apart and being ready for a new skill, which is maybe putting together. So they need the help of an adult to put the ping pong ball back inside the whisk. And it may take them 150 times, it could take them 2,000 times. But that's what they need to repeat and repeat to learn all they can from this activity until they're ready to move on to the next one. So maybe the next activity is going to be, instead of a ping pong ball, maybe I'm going to add a golf ball, because a golf ball weighs a lot more than a ping pong ball. And when you pick it up or you put it in your hand, it's heavier, and a ping pong ball is lighter. And if you can see in just a short period of time how I'm taking you through the dynamic learning circle with a whisk, a ping pong ball, and a golf ball, what happens if I add plates and cups Or maybe a child learns to grasp the toy and they start banging the toy on their hand or using two hands. That's how you get a child to continuously learn new skills throughout their life. And what is also important for the adults that are working with children with multiple special needs is you have to recognize where things go wrong in the dynamic learning circle so that you can make adjustments and make an environment that's enriched that children can learn from. And we're going to talk about that in the next topic.
This presentation was completed in collaboration with the LilyWorks Active Learning Foundation, the Penrynton Center for the Blind, the Texas School for the Blind, and the Perkins School for the Blind. For more resources, please visit their websites or www.activelearningspace.org.